Okay. Okay. Welcome everybody. Let's we can finally start. Let me pray and then we'll jump in. Father God, we thank you just for this time, and Lord, as we look into your word, I pray, God, that your spirit would be moving amongst all of us, and you would be teaching us, and you would be revealing new things to us about your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, just to make sure, just make sure everybody is muted, just so we don't have any kind of background noises going on. As well, these sessions are going to be recorded. I've had a couple of requests to record it. If you don't want your face in the recording, you can turn off your video. We won't be offended or anything like that. Okay. I will also in these sessions, I'll stop in the middle of the session a few times just to see if anybody has any questions. And I think because of the number of people, if you do have a question, I would ask that you would type it in the chat. Just kind of send it to everybody. You can type your questions in Chinese as well. I'll have someone to translate the questions to me. But feel free to ask at any time. Then I'll just stop after in a few different places and answer any questions there. Okay. There are session notes. So it's you can see the website on the screen. Feel free to download all of them. For today, we're just going to go through session 1. But if you're interested, kind of looking ahead, I have session 2 and 3 there as well as an Old Testament map that you can timeline that you can download, and the Old Testament timeline we'll refer to in a future session. Okay, and I do have to say thank you to Eddie and Jolinda for taking the time to translate all of the handouts. It's a lot to translate, so so thank you to them. Okay, this is my Bible overview course. As you know, there are 66 books in the Bible. That's quite a lot of books. We have 6 sessions, so there's going to be an average of 11 books per session. Although today we're just going to go through 5 books. So there will be quite a lot of information given. Today will be a bit of a shorter session, but the next few might be a little bit longer. But because of the amount of information there is on the Bibles, on the books in the Bible, the focus will be on just an overview. So I'm not going to go through every book in detail. That can be maybe a future course if we want to focus on one or 2 books. But with the notes here, feel free to for the next time you can print them out. You can write notes on them. They're there for you to as reference. But just please do make good use of the notes. Okay, let's start. So today we are going to go through the Torah. All right, the Torah. So this is the name of that's given to the first 5 books in the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so just as kind of an introduction to the Torah, we need to answer a few different questions. So first of all, who wrote the Torah? Now, generally, it's Moses, right? He wrote most of it. Now, over the years, there have been some editing, some additions from various sources and authors, but the traditionally accepted kind of main author, the guy who wrote kind of the core of the Torah, is Moses. Who was he writing to? Right? Now we have to remember that Moses was not writing originally to you and me. Right? We are reading it now, but Moses was not writing to you and me. He was writing to the Israelites. Right? This is important to know. So he was writing to the Israelites. Now, when was it written? We don't know exactly, but simply put, this was during Moses' time with the Israelites. So, when they were kind of wandering through the wilderness, through the desert. Where was it written and read? Well, it was written during the years in the desert. And it was read during the years in the desert, but not only in the desert, right? The Torah would have been read throughout the Jewish history. Now, why was it written? Now, the answer to this question is a little bit more complicated. So Moses wrote it originally to the Israelites that he was leading through the desert. Okay. Now, where have the Israelites been for the past several hundred years? They've been in Egypt. This Egypt was the culture that probably most or all of them had grown up in, right? So in Egypt, they would have experienced a lot of the Egyptian culture. They would have heard a lot of the Egyptian stories. They would have understood all the symbolism, the religion, the politics, all of that stuff. They would have understood, and they would have been, they would have experienced in their lives, right? So some of the stories, they would have grown up with the stories of Egyptian creation, how the Egyptians understood how the world was made. They would have grown up with stories of the many gods that that Egypt worshipped, and how the creator gods brought the sky and the sun and the cities and life out of the chaotic waters. Now Moses is a very smart guy, right? He's no fool. He knows that the Israelites, that these people, his people, are steeped in the stories of Egypt, that they've grown up with these stories, and that much of their understanding of the world is shaped by the Egyptian worldview. So what does Moses do? He tells them stories. It's similar to like when I was growing up. I grew up in Canada. I was very westernized. And I remember, many times when I was growing up, my father would be telling me stories of how he grew up, telling me stories of my family history, about the homeland, and just how our family got to this point in Canada, right? And so this was kind of what Moses was doing. He was giving them stories about who they were, about their own history, helping them to understand who they were. And especially he wanted them to understand the the story of creation. Okay, so creation was an important story that the Jewish people, the Israelites, needed to understand. Now, there are some suggestions that some of the biblical stories, like creation, the flood, the laws, it sounds similar to the stories of other nations, right? There are the Sumerians, Babylonians, Hittites. All these other nations had similar stories. So these stories of creation and flood and laws and all that kind of stuff, they were not unique to the Bible. And some people are saying, well, Moses probably maybe plagiarized, probably stole those stories from other nations. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more likely that Moses was aware of the stories of the other nations, and he wrote the Jewish stories of creation and the flood as an argument or as a defense to counteract the stories that the Israelites grew up hearing and possibly even believing in Egypt. Right? He wanted the Israelites to have the proper worldview with an understanding that it is actually God, Yahweh God, who was the creator and who was the source of all these stories. So that's kind of generally why Moses tells the stories, wrote the Torah. So next question is, what is in the Torah? So let's start with Genesis. Now, there's a few things that I want to point out in Genesis. The first is the importance of creation. Now, creation was this is to correct their understanding of God and his relationship to this world. And so the story that you find in Genesis 1 and creation was to counteract the stories about creation that other nations, especially Egypt, was telling. Because what I believe is what you believe about creation, the creation of the world, will determine how you live your life. Right? If you believe that there is a creator God, a loving God who created the world, that influences how you live your life and what your relationship is to this world. If you believe that, for example, the world was created randomly, through Big Bang evolution, if you believe that the world is just a blip, a random occurrence in this world, then that really does affect how you live. Right? There's no purpose. There's no meaning. Everything is just a random occurrence. So it's important what you believe about creation, because that affects how you live your life. So that's why I think Moses starts off with creation right at the beginning, Genesis 1. Okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. Now, the ancient world, the belief, when they saw the waters, the seas, the lakes, the sea the sea was the home to chaos and monsters. Right, it was a very dark place. There's a lot of myths, a lot of stories about scary things in the waters. And Moses starts off, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the next verses talks about the waters and how the Spirit was hovering over the water. So right at the beginning, God already conquers the chaos by putting things in order. The water was nothing to be afraid of because God already conquered the waters. And then in Egypt, they had gods of the land, gods of the sky, the air. Those are all gods to be worshipped. Now, Genesis 1 doesn't name these gods, but instead declares that these physical creations, like land, sky, air, those things on earth are merely things that serve God's purpose on earth. Okay? Those things are not God's. Those things are created by God for God's purpose. And then in some ancient cultures, they based their kind of days and months and years on the lunar cycle. And so because of that, the 7th day, the 14th day, 21st, and the 28th days of the month were considered unlucky. Okay, and so the creation week deliberately opposes that belief by declaring that the 7th day, every 7th day, is blessed. Okay, so in the creation story, at the heart of this creation theology that Moses presents is this revolutionary message that this one personal, benevolent God overcomes the darkness, overcomes the chaos to create a good world. Now, if you read through the creation story, it mentions God calls the world good. He calls it 7 times good. You know, God saw that what he did and it was good 7 times. Okay, so God overcomes the chaos, overcomes the darkness to create a good world for humanity to live in. God is the creator of the good world and the ruler of the universe. Okay, and then next we have the importance of humanity. The importance of humanity. So God, human beings are created. God creates them in His image. He gives them a body and a soul. As humans, human beings, we have both, right? The physical body and this non-physical essence within us. We cannot be human without one or the other. And human beings are the climax of God's creation. Okay, we're the only thing that God creates that is in God's image. And so, as people made in His image, God gives a commission that human beings, that you and I, we are to be caretakers of the good world that God created. And God gives us a purpose. He gives us a sense of responsibility. Okay, and then the importance of the fall. Now, chapter 1 sees, God creating the world. It's very cosmic. And then when you go to chapter 2 in Genesis, it's kind of like like a zooming close up of the world, and we focus in on the Garden of Eden. And there we get this temptation story. And so why is the temptation story there? It's there to help us understand that there is evil and temptation. And this evil and temptation, it comes from somewhere. Now, have you ever wondered why Satan is depicted as a snake? Why is Satan depicted as a snake? Why is Satan not a bunny rabbit or a butterfly or a squirrel? Why a snake? Right? So, if you kind of think of put yourself in Moses' mindset, how do you explain the devil to a people who have no concept of the devil? Right? So you would look for something that they would associate as evil. So why a snake? Has any idea where the Israelites might have seen a snake before? If you look at the pictures here, what is on the crown that Pharaoh wears? A serpent, right? This is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the one who built his empire on the backs of the Israelite slaves. So using this image of a snake, Moses is able to explain what evil is, because uh, the Israelites experienced that evil in Egypt. Okay, so yeah, so there's that temptation. You know the story, Adam and Eve. Satan comes, tempts them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So humanity, by eating from that tree, humanity wants to be their own God. They want to decide what is right and wrong for themselves. They don't want God to tell them what is right and wrong. Okay, they want to decide. That is the rebellion. That is the pride. That's where sin comes in. So as a consequence of that, there's now a change in the relationship between the man and woman and between humanity and the earth. And this is part of sin's doing. Okay. But God doesn't just leave the man and woman alone. He gives them a promise that one of Eve's descendants will crush the serpent's head. Right. So that's looking forward to Jesus Christ. Ready. Okay. So we can't go through all the stories in Genesis. I just wanted to point out the beginning of Genesis because that's important. That kind of sets the tone for basically the whole Bible and the whole story of God, dealing with sin and kind of restoring this world and restoring humanity. Okay. But anyways, those are a couple things to point out. So you have in your notes kind of the basic structure in the book of Genesis. So every book of the Bible, I'm gonna give you kind of the basic structure of the book, so that when you do maybe do Bible studies or if you're reading those books, hopefully this structure will help you understand the book better and kind of know where the themes are and the direction that the books are going. So in Genesis, it's very simple. We have early history, which is Genesis 1 to 11. And Genesis 1 to 11, this is a long period of history. It could be hundreds or thousands of years. We don't know exactly how long that is. But essentially, 1 to 11 is it's a downward spiral of sin. Okay, it's a downward spiral of sin. So it starts off with the disobedience of Adam and Eve, and then it goes on to murder, and then to reckless killing, and then to obsessive lust, and then to total corruption and violence, and then to the total disruption of humanity. Right, so everything just kind of gets progressively worse and worse and worse from 1 to 11. Now, God's commission to human beings in Genesis 1 is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, human beings fail to do that. Right, and at the end of I think chapter 11, the human beings, they don't fill the earth, they don't spread out. Instead, they take it upon themselves to try to be God, and that's represented by the Tower of Babel. And so what does God do? He confuses the language so that they will gather with their own language groups and they will spread out. And as they spread out, they then accomplish God's purpose that he set to them in Genesis 1. So we have this spreading out from 1 to 11 at the end of chapter 11. And then at the end of this downward spiral of sin, history then kind of slows down. And then we focus on one man, on Abraham. God's interaction with him. So from Abraham, then we get the patriarchs of Israel. We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then we have the Joseph story. The Joseph story, even though it's inspiring, it's actually put there to explain how Israel ended up in Egypt. Now, after the Joseph story, Joseph he doesn't play any other role after that. But in Egypt, when the family moves to Egypt, Abraham's family then now becomes a nation, right? They multiply, they grow, they become a nation. Now, Joseph's story reminds us that God overrules the wicked intentions of human beings. His brothers trying to kill him in order to save his people. His brother trying to kill him. So God overrules the wicked in order to save his people. Now, the Israelites have to learn that God always wants to save them. And this is a theme that runs throughout the Old Testament, but it's most explicit in Joseph's story, right? God wants to save his people. Okay, so now we move to Exodus. For the Israelites, now many of them lived through the stories of Exodus, so they would know a bit more about the events in the book of Exodus. So what Moses is doing is giving them the theological side of their experience. What does it mean that they went through all this experience, all these experiences? What do the experiences mean? And having been in Egypt for hundreds of years, this book is meant to instruct the people about who God is and to remind them of what God did for them. Now, the entire Torah is about Israel's relationship with God, but they need to understand who God is, right? And so Exodus introduces that. So in Exodus, we get three basic sections. The first section, 1 to 18, is the main theme is that God saves. Okay, God makes a covenant with Abraham. God remembers that covenant. God doesn't forget his promise. Okay, God is committed to his promise, his covenant to Israel. Another theme in 1 to 18 is that God is present. He tells Moses to tell the people that his name is I am. Okay, so I am means I am with you, or I will be with you. Okay, God's name is about his presence. And another theme is that God is the mighty deliverer. He's the mighty warrior. Okay, God shows in Egypt that he will fight for his people. So when Moses is battling Pharaoh, it's actually God who's battling Pharaoh. Okay? And so the fight between God and Pharaoh is about who is in control, who is the one who is actually in control of the world. Okay, God fights for his people. Now, in Exodus, we find out that it's not just the Israelites are not just God's people. Right? In Exodus 4:22, God actually calls Israel my son. Okay, Israel is my son. So it's more than just relationship between God and people and humanity. It's God and his children. Right? They are his children. Yeah, so we have Moses confronting Pharaoh. The first encounter, remember Aaron's staff becomes a snake, right? And then Pharaoh's magicians, their staffs also become a snake, right? Remember the whole thing about snakes, right? Now Aaron's snake devours it eats up all of Pharaoh's snakes. Now that's symbolism there, right? That's to communicate that actually Pharaoh has no power, right? God is the one who has power. And then we have the plagues, again, a battle between God and not just Pharaoh now, but the gods of Egypt. Again, who has control over creation? Who has control over the created things, and who has control over life in general? It is God. Right? And so that's what the battle shows, the 10 plagues. Right? So after all of that, finally uh, Moses is able to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into the wilderness, and there, the people get hungry, and God shows them once again he doesn't, he's not just with them, he doesn't just fight for them, but he also provides for them, and so he gives them manna and quail to eat in the desert. Okay, so 1 to 18 is this big theme of that God saves. And then from 19 to 24 rules, God is king. And as king, he gives them he gives them the law. And the law is about the relationship between God and Israel. Now the law reflects God's holiness. And that's why in the law, when you read through the laws, there's a lot about holiness, a lot about purity in there, because it has to do with God's holiness. For the Israelites to be in a relationship with a holy God, the Israelites need to be holy as well. So we have to understand that the law is not there to establish the relationship. Okay, the relationship is already there. The law is about how to maintain the relationship, or how to have a relationship with God. Okay. Let's see. There's also the kingdom of priests, right, who serve society and bring about God's blessing. So Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests. They were to be people who would bless the world. Right? That was their responsibility. One day, the small nation of Israel would bless the world. Right? And then ultimately God gives them the 10 commandments, plus the book of law. Now the 10 commandments, you can say that it's kind of more a summary of all the laws. There's a whole bunch of kind of individual laws that's given in Exodus. I think that pertains particularly to Israel's context, right? But everything about those particular laws can be summarized in the 10 commandments, right? So we have God rules, and then the last section, 25 to 40, is about God. Is that God dwells, God is present with them. And these stories, this is all about building the tabernacle, which represents God's presence. Okay, good. So the idea is God is close by to them. He is among them. He is not some distant God who kind of sits off, far away and just kind of watches. Right? God is very intimate. God is with them. Right? Again, this reflects His name. Right? Yahweh, I am. God is with them. Okay, and then and also that God is to be worshipped. Right, the tabernacle is meant to represent God's earthly home. And if you read through the building of the tabernacle and try to imagine what it looks like, the inside of the tabernacle is meant to imitate heaven, right? So that when you walk into the tabernacle, it's supposed to be like, you're walking into heaven itself. It's supposed to be very, very adorned grandly inside. Yeah, and again, the whole idea that God is holy. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a moment. Any questions? One question. Apart from the serpent, the snake, were there other animals speaking to Adam and Eve? Uh, the Bible doesn't say anything about other animals speaking. Probably not. I would say. I think the animals were there to be cared for by them. Yeah. So I haven't heard of any suggestions of any other animals speaking to Adam and Eve. Okay. Okay, if no more questions, let's move on. Okay, Leviticus, a very, very interesting book. I don't know if anyone here has actually tried to sit through and read Leviticus. It's not the most exciting book to read. But if you kind of flip through the pages of Leviticus, and you kind of, you don't have to read through everything, but if you look at the subheadings in Leviticus, what do you notice? A lot of Leviticus has to do with sacrifice. Okay, it has to do with sacrifice. Now, Leviticus is basically a book on how to worship God, right? And a lot of it's written to the priests, to the Levites. It was, in a sense, an instruction manual. Okay, an instruction manual on worship, but also an instruction manual on sacrifice. Now, I guess you can say that the big message is that sacrifice is a gift that we bring to God. Okay, and we might not necessarily think of sacrifice as a gift, but it is. When we sacrifice something to God, for God, it is a gift that we bring to God. Sacrifice is also something that we do, but it's something that we offer God. Okay? Sacrifice has to do with communion. It has to do with fellowship with God. We learn that sacrifice is required for forgiveness. Right? Now everything in Leviticus has to do with preserving holiness. Right? Again, God is holy and cannot tolerate sin. So the sacrificial system is how the Israelites are to be holy in their relationship with God, how they are to maintain holiness in their relationship with God. Okay, so I don't want to say too much about Leviticus. Otherwise, this is kind of the basic structure. We have sacrificial laws, priestly narratives, laws to protect your cleanness, and then a holiness code there. Okay. And then jumping to the next book. Sorry, let me get to this question. So, stories of creation that Moses wrote, is it an exact representation of what happened in the ancient years, or is it written to specifically refute the current Egyptian stories? Okay, so the creation story in Genesis 1, there's basically two views. One is what we call the literal view. So some people believe that God created the world in 7 days. Okay, so a literal 7 days for creation. For me personally, I don't believe that the creation story in Genesis 1 is meant to be read literally. Okay. First of all, Moses was not there at creation. Secondly, my question is, why would it take God any time at all to create? And thirdly, I think most importantly, is that Genesis 1 was actually, if you look at the style of Genesis 1, it's actually written as a poem, not as a story, like a narrative story. It's written as a poem. So if you know anything about poems have a lot of symbolism, they have metaphor, they have all this other literature kind of stuff in there. So I personally would read Genesis 1 as more of a poem, and the fact that I think the main message in Genesis 1 is that God created the world. Nobody else created the world. It's just God, right? Genesis 1 doesn't actually tell us how God does it, right, from a technical standpoint. So Moses writes it as a poem, just to simply say that God is the one who is behind creation. Okay. Okay, let's go to Numbers. Okay, Numbers. What a boring name for a book. It's just called Numbers. Uh, the word for the name of this book actually comes from the Greek version of the Old Testament. Uh, what do you expect when you open up this book? Well, when you open up this book, it starts off with a list, right? A list of names, a list of numbers, right? Now, the thing is, in the Jewish name for this book is actually Numbers. The Jewish name, I think, is a lot better. It's this book is actually called or translated In the Wilderness. Okay, and that's a little bit more descriptive, right? In the Wilderness. So the context of this book, I'm just going to call it Numbers, just because that's what we mostly know it as. The book of Numbers. The context is takes place in the 40 years that Israel wandered in the desert. So what happens in the 40 years? There's a lot that happens, but I think the most significant thing about this book is that most of the first generation, so the generation that came out of Egypt, they don't go into the promised land. Okay, so they don't end up going into the promised land. So that's kind of the big thing in this book. Now, the structure basically is just the old. You got the first generation of God's people, where God continues to provide for them, even though after experiencing everything that they went through in Egypt, they still rebelled against God. Right? God still continued to provide for them. Sin and judgment upon them, except for Caleb and Joshua. And that Israel is still God's special people. And so there's a story of Balaam, and there's the talking donkey. And the main theme there is that God, Israel is still God's special people. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, and this has to do with Numbers, actually, in the book of Numbers. If you look at chapter 2, verse 32, it says this, these are the Israelites counted. So this is kind of like a census taken. Counted according to the families, all the men in the camps by the divisions, number 603,550. So this is in chapter 2. So this was a count of a general count of the first generation that came out of Egypt. Okay, and then when you jump to near to the end of the book of Numbers, there is another census taken of the next generation. And it says the total number of the men of Israel, this is chapter 26, 51, was 601,730. Okay. The numbers between the first generation, second generation, were roughly the same. Now, what that tells us is that even though the first generation rebelled against God, God was gracious enough that he maintained Israel's numbers. He didn't try to wipe them away. Even though many of them were punished because of sin, rebellion, because they decided to turn their backs from God. Even though they did that, God didn't deplete their numbers. He didn't reduce their numbers. Right? I mean, there's a couple thousand less men, but it's not a significant amount. Okay, so the number of the second generation was roughly the same as the first generation. So at the end of Numbers, the people are they're preparing to go into the promised land. Now the question is, will this second generation be faithful, or will they rebel just like the first generation did? Okay, and that's what we don't know. And that's kind of like a little bit of a cliffhanger to end the book of Numbers. Okay, and then from Numbers we get the final book in the Torah. Now, Deuteronomy is arguably the most important Old Testament book. Okay, Deuteronomy is probably the most important Old Testament book because it goes to the heart of the issues in the relationship between God and human beings. Deuteronomy actually influences many of the prophets' writings, and Deuteronomy also has a huge influence in the New Testament gospel writers. Right? For example, when Jesus was facing temptation in the desert, he quotes scripture to the devil, and all of that scripture comes from Deuteronomy. Right? So Deuteronomy, what does Deuteronomy mean? Deuteros means second, and then nomos means law. So we might think of this as the second law or the second giving of the law, or even a second version, an updated version, if you will, for this next generation. Okay, for the second generation who will be making their way into the promised land. But in Deuteronomy, it's more than just law, right? This version is used as, in a sense, like a renewal, like when a married couple goes through a renewal of their vows, right? Deuteronomy is kind of like that, like a renewal of the covenant between God and Israel. And this is important for Israel because things are about to change, right? They're no longer going to be wandering around in the desert. They are going to be going into the promised land. And when they go into the promised land, there will be different issues that they will face. Okay. So hence the updated law. As well, Deuteronomy also contains the kind of the last will and testament of Moses. So Moses is going to die. And so this book also prepares Israel for life without Moses. Right? And then there's also war. There will be war. So conquering the land that God will give the people, right? The land is not free. There are people living there. And so God is giving them that land, and so they will need to fight for it. Right? So Deuteronomy deals with that kind of stuff. How do we engage with battle? What do we do with the stuff that we find, with the plunder? Right? How do we treat the neighbors when we finally settle there? How do we treat the foreign nations and all that kind of stuff? Okay, so basic structure there: introduction, history, conditions, curses and blessings. This is about obedience and disobedience, and then succession arrangements and conclusion. So there's a lot that going on in Deuteronomy, but I think one word that actually summarizes Deuteronomy the best is, I would say, love. Okay? Deuteronomy is the book of love, because after the introduction and the warnings and the reminders and the law is given to the people, there's the 10 commandments first, followed by chapter 6, and then there's the 10 commandments, followed by Deuteronomy 6, 1-5. And 6, 1-5 is where it talks about Israel needing to love God with all their strength, all their mind, all their heart, all their mind. Okay, so that's an important part of the relationship between Israel and God, that they must love God. And Deuteronomy reminds the people that they need to love God. And as we read through kind of the laws of God, Israel and us, we need to also keep in mind that love is the foundation of the law. Without love for God, the law becomes just very cold. The law becomes a list of things to do, a list of rules. Right? It becomes very impersonal, and the law becomes burdensome. So right at the beginning, love has always been at the core of God's people. And so they need to understand, they need to remember that the law is there, but the foundation of the law is love. Okay, and then even Paul writes in Romans 13:10, he says, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is what is needed to obey the law fully. Love is the goal of the law. Okay. Okay, and that's it for today. Going through the Torah. Next time, we're going to go through several more books called the Writings, and then in the third session, we're going to go through probably, well, we will go through all of the prophets. Okay, so I think those sessions, the next couple of sessions might be a bit longer than an hour, so just kind of be just be aware of that. Yeah, just be aware of that. Okay. I think we can stop the recording